I mean, tell us the history of the Republican Party, 18.
Yes, 1854. So when we look at the Republican Party as a whole, started in Wisconsin in 1854, and the goal was to stop the spread of slavery. And we had things like the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And so Republicans in a small place in Wisconsin decided it's time to go ahead and stop that and start to focus on the economy and also focus on freedom for the slaves. And so, of course, we would end up with people like Abraham Lincoln, and eventually the Emancipation Proclamation, Civil War, all that stuff would take place. But in the great state of Texas, it would be a few years later. The Republican Party here started on July 4th of 1867 in the great city of Houston, with 150 black men and 20 Anglos. Most people don't know that.
150. So tell us a little bit about how 150 black men all come to the helm to be the fire starters, the igniters of Texas's Republican movement.
Absolutely. So during this time, during the 1860s, of course, we have black people that are newly freed and newly enfranchised. And we had several groups that were coming in. The Freedmen's Bureau was one. Freedmen's Bureau with the 38th Congress, they were extremely supportive in making sure that blacks were being able to learn to read and write, making sure that contracts were fair that were provided to blacks, making sure that newly freed blacks were able to find their people that were sold into slavery, their family members. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was established in Texas as well by way of the federal government and the military, and they were Republican-led as well, all intended purposes. And then you had other organizations that were doing the same, that really just talked to black people about the quest for their freedom. And in doing so, again, these were Republican-based people. The black people during this time, that 150, felt not only obligated in a certain sense or extent, but also felt a commitment to make sure they support Republican principles. So in Houston, they met, they came together because during this time they had to organize themselves. Keep in mind, 1854, they were already in existence. Fast forward to 1867. Fast forward to the point that blacks are now free. Fast forward to the point that you had the Freedom's Bureau and places like that, courting the black people, which were now able to get registered to vote, and the 20 Anglos, and they coordinated and they started the Republican Party of Texas.
What did that group of 150 black men comprise of, as far as from an economic standpoint? What did they do in life?
Economically, some of the ones that stand out, they were newly freed slaves. You know, one that stood out the most for me, his name is G.T. Ruby. G.T. Ruby was one, too, which was a newly freed slave, but G.T. Ruby was instrumental in making sure that legislation was passed forth and things of that nature. Another was Matthew Gaines. If you've heard of Texas A&M, I know there are a lot of Aggies people out there. Texas A&M or even Prairie View A&M. Matthew Gaines was a slave from Pineville, Louisiana. He escaped from slavery 3 times. The 3rd time he escaped, he was caught here in Texas by the Texas Rangers, and he was placed back into slavery during that time. Wow. And only once he found his freedom through the emancipation process did Matthew Gaines, in a short period of time, become a Texas state senator. So here we have a lot of former slaves, not freedmen at the time, but a lot of former slaves who became freedmen, that the Republican Party not only embraced them, but gave them an opportunity to become part of the leadership with the Republican Party of Texas from its very inception.
That's a fascinating heritage of Texas from 1867. So after Abraham Lincoln, then we saw the next 11 of 14 presidents were all Republicans.
Yes, yes, and that's not uncommon, because keep in mind, post-Civil War, during this time, Republicans were strong throughout the nation. They were so strong that even if we look at the great state of Texas, we didn't have as much dominance with the Republican Party, because looking at Texas, for example, from 1867 to 1872, Republicans were extremely dominant in that they controlled the Texas legislature, and they also controlled the governor's office. But by 1872-73, a turn took place, because the Republicans during this time had conservatives on one side and you had radical Republicans on the other side, and they split. And during this time, again, this is the 1860s through 1872 and 73, when they split, the Texas legislature was lost to Democrats, and the governor's office in 1873 was lost to Democrats, and it would remain that way for the next 120 years.
100. And what do you attribute that 120-year kind of ruling for?
Two things. It's attributed to two things. Number one, as I mentioned, the split. When you have, from its very inception, you have the Republican Party. Keep in mind, July 4th, 1867, that's the inception. But the state of Texas, keep in mind, at one point, they seceded from the Union. In order to get back into the Union, they had to have a constitution of the states, right? Or a constitutional convention. When they had that constitutional convention in 1868, you had two factions within the Republican Party. Conservatives, which would be more left-leaning this day and time. Some would even consider them Republicans in name only, or rhinos.
Okay.
You had them, they were led by Andrew J. Hamilton. Okay. And you had the radicals on the other side. They were more right-leaning, and they would be your strong right Republicans this day and time. They were led by E.J. Davis and a gentleman by the name of Morgan C. Hamilton, which was the brother of Andrew Hamilton. And so they had a split from the very beginning, and because of that split, it was a lot of the split was leaning on the fact that the conservatives wanted to keep things the way they were and kind of merge on into this new opportunity. The radicals wanted to say anything that we did governmentally, you need to erase and let's start with a clean slate. They couldn't agree on that. They couldn't agree on platform issues, and because of that, ultimately they had a split, and that split caused a power struggle. And that power struggle would continue to linger on for the next few years. Okay. The second point, before I forget, second point was the fact that the radicals realized the importance and the value of the black vote. Okay. The conservatives at the time did not value the black vote as much, even though the Republican Party started as a base or biracial base component. They started their party, or the party started here in Texas that way, but it didn't remain that way, unfortunately. And with the loss of that black vote, Democrats looked at it as an opportunity to gain that new voting bloc that did not previously exist, so that Southern Democrats can begin to gain the power they once had. And so with an abandonment of that voting bloc and the Democrats seeking it, those two components alone within 6 years caused the Republican Party of Texas to lose power for the next 120 years.
Quite the reign that they had there. What were the policies that you said that they couldn't agree on?
Yes, the main thing, the conservatives, one of the things they wanted to do, they wanted to focus on economics. They wanted to focus on business and things of that nature, big business. However, the radicals on the other end, they wanted to focus on bringing the slaves into the fold, the newly freed slaves into the fold. And so they wanted to look at more of the social issues, make sure they're establishing schools to educate the newly freed people and things of that nature. And so they couldn't agree on that. Like this day and time, if we were to look at the Republican Party of Texas in 2021 and last 10 years, we have platforms. The platform comes because people speak to their precinct chairs. The precinct chairs take those platform issues to their county chairs, and those chairmen at that point, they take it on to the convention, to the state convention, ultimately. And so those platform things are voted on. Once they're voted on, of course, that's now going to be pushed to our state legislature as these are our important legislative agenda items. And so even during this time, the same thing was taking place. However, they just had a difference of opinion as to what was going to be important for the platform. And again, one was looking more monetarily because we're post-Civil War. The other were looking more towards the social and moral aspects and fabrics of the party and the people of Texas. And they couldn't agree upon it.